Our next session, how can energy transitions balance growth, decarbonization, and human development? Please welcome to the stage our moderator, Director of Energy and Climate Policy, Duke University Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment and Sustainability, Jackson Ewing, Deputy CEO, Sustainability for Everyone for All, Stefano Marguccio, former CEO of Global Innovation Fund and current Duke University Executive in Residence, Alix Peterson Zwane, and Managing Director, Citibank, Stephanie von Frendenberg.
Thank you to the organizers here at the Nest and for all of you for being with us. As just mentioned, I'm Jackson Ewing, Director of Energy and Climate Policy at the Duke University Nicholas Institute. It's my privilege to be chairing this session. As Dr. Glendon's fascinating presentation just put in stark relief, our infrastructure decisions are extremely important, especially in this context of a rapidly changing climate. And I would argue that perhaps nowhere is that more the case than in the energy sector. So during our next 45 minutes, we want to get into what some of the tensions are that exist between decarbonization and human flourishing and development. When things go well, these two sets of goals can work hand in hand and all be swimming the same direction. But there are instances, I think, when very difficult decisions have to be made and priorities have to be drawn. And so without any further barrier between you and the speakers, let's dive in. I want to begin with you, Stefano. At SEforALL, you all put as a core mission the alleviation of energy poverty. And at the same time, you claim that that alleviation must be undertaken with clean and sustainable energy sources. So what are the core barriers that you're facing in your work to realizing that objective?
Thank you for the question. Well, to electrify a country in the developing world is always a challenge. If I have to jot down the 5 main barriers, would be the planning and policy. I mean, you need a framework that is a legal framework that is friendly to the electrification. You need the skills, and these are skills that are related to the institutions of the country and also to the workforce of the countries. And the other enabler is the infrastructures. A grid is a public common good, in my opinion. If you don't have a grid, you cannot really electrify meaningfully a country. And then what you need is finance, right? If you think about this year, probably the amount of finance that went to energy is $3 trillion US. 2 went to green energy, and probably only 14% will go to the developing world. So this is another barrier. And finally, I would say we have an issue of technology access, right? A lot of these technologies that are necessary to give access to developing countries are not developed in-house. And while there is this gap between countries having workforce and raw materials and not having the technology and the skills to build their systems. So these, I would say, are the 5 main barriers that are in the way to give to these countries a working energy system.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to get into each of those in a bit more granularity as our conversation evolves. Right now, I want to move to you, though, Alix. And both your work at Global Innovation Fund and now with us at Duke, you've been really adamant about the point that the best adaptation strategies and the best development and human flourishing approaches all are predicated, at least to some degree, on economic growth. And I wonder if you see any tensions between the pursuit of that economic growth and the imperatives of decarbonization.
Yeah, thanks, and lovely to be here with all of you on this such an important week. Just stepping back for a minute, I think it's important for us to remember how tightly correlated poverty reduction and economic growth are. And economic growth and poverty reduction are also very tightly correlated with other measures of, fundamentally the things that we care about, whether that's child mortality, access to basic needs, et cetera. And so growth really is an imperative if we take seriously our shared responsibility amongst each other to have a flourishing society for everyone and all lives have equal value. So that's the sort of central challenge that we have. And now we have to place that into the context of climate change. And on the one hand, you can be a little bit gloomy about this. If we say, look, we collectively as a world have committed to net zero by 2050, well, India, to just take one example, right now has committed to net zero by 2070, which means that if globally we're going to hit that 2050 target, we're going to have to reduce below zero in some of the other big importing emitting countries like the US and China. Or there's going to be some kind of a conversation in which India is asked to reduce its goals around growth, which is to become a high-income country by 2047, 100 years after independence. Not only is that an unrealistic ask of either the US or of India, but it's not ethical either. So what are we going to have to do to resolve some of these tensions? I suggest, and I think, what we need to do is feel our way towards a different kind of a bargain in which there's real increases in state capacity for thinking more ambitiously about energy transitions in important emerging markets, in emerging countries. And equally, not just a commitment for finance from the US and its allies, but also a commitment to technology transfer, to increased trade, and to increased investment on the back of greater state capacity, improved quality of regulation, and a durable political commitment to thinking more ambitiously so that investors can be confident that they have longer time horizons on which to plan that outlast any local political cycles. So I think there's a new and important conversation to be had so that we can be ambitious about both the climate goals and the critical centrality of economic growth.
Thanks, Alix. I'm struck there not only by this, but certainly by the degree to which that bargain you just described really defines the terms of what is going to be argued over and ideally negotiated at Baku this year on the new collective quantified goal. I'm finally getting that acronym where I can roll it off the tongue a little bit. There you go, NCQG. All of this is going to depend on actual on-the-ground projects, development and execution. So I want to move to you on that, Stephanie. I'm going to crudely frame a debate and do so in an oversimplified way, but hopefully in a way that gives you some runway to discuss your work and your views on this. We hear competing stories about the nature of the potential project pipelines for clean energy in low and middle income countries. On the one hand, we hear oftentimes from many sources of finance and capital that there's a dearth of such shovel-ready projects that can offer a viable return on investments. And from the other side of that coin, we hear that there are plenty of projects, in fact, but that for various barriers or risk amplifications or exaggerations, those projects aren't being funded. So I wonder, both from your perspective, working for long years in development finance and now in private finance, how you view this debate.
It's a really great question, and I've heard it raised many times this week, and certain people say, oh, there's plenty of projects, so just other issues, there's no projects. I kind of think it's a both and I would actually bifurcate the middle income and upper middle income and then the lower income. And when I look at the middle income and upper middle income, there are shovel-ready projects. I think two things are happening there. One, in the billions to trillions agenda, the institutional investors that you would want playing in that space find the risk difficult to understand and to quantify, and the bespoke nature of those projects, because they're very complex project finance, difficult to actually analyze and understand because they're used to buying pools of assets or standardized assets. So in the middle income, that's one of the problems. The second problem is we've set very, very high KPIs for our development institutions and said, we want you to do 40 or 50% of your balance sheet green. So they go to the places where there's shovel-ready projects and they finance those projects. And it kind of knocks the private sector that might have been willing to stretch, maybe stretch with a little bit of blended finance, off the table. So that's the middle income. In the lower income, I think, both of the other panelists, Stefano and Alix, have said there's a lack of capacity. And I think in the lower income countries, the capacity to design and implement projects around really good regulatory frameworks where you know that the rule of law will be honored throughout the course of a contract. So if you have an independent power project that has a power purchase agreement for 20 or 25 years, are we really sure that the next administration and the administration after that will actually honor those contracts? So I think there's deeper issues in the lower income countries that need to be addressed. And actually, when I was at IFC, we created this thing called upstream, and everybody sort of said, what is that? And now it's kind of become lingo. But the question we were asking ourselves is, if this is the box, how do we push the walls out? And how do we use the development skills of in institutions like IFC to actually start generating projects so there are more shovel-ready things to do?
Oh, thank you. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to help answer that question as we go along. But before doing so, I want to pivot a little bit to the what we'll call the finance supply side and talk about some of the limitations that are faced there. In addition to what you've mentioned about potential crowding out of the private sector, what are some of the structural impediments that exist from regulations such as Basel, from the requirements of board approval for projects in higher risk environments, for the different limitations that might exist for different sources of finance like pension funds, et cetera? How do you view those barriers and how might they be overcome?
Yeah, so two things there, and I'll end with regulation because I think it's the most complex one. But the assessment of risk is difficult, and when you don't have boots on the ground in those countries every single day, and you bring a project to your risk committee, they hesitate because they don't really understand the risk, and it's very hard to quantify. The data is not fully there. So I've actually spent a lot of time since I joined Citi in working with the risk organizations to say, can we create some risk overlays using things like the GEMS database, so the Global Emerging Markets database that's just released some data to actually prove that the default and loss given default ratios in some of these countries are actually better than you would expect, and that looking at one's zip code is not necessarily the only thing to do in terms of assessing risk. And country risk is something that all banks have, through regulation, actually pretty stringent rules around. But I think the issue that gets less attention is this regulatory issue. So you hear a lot about, well, we need to improve the policy and regulation in emerging markets to get the money to flow. I actually think that the billions to trillions agenda has partly been held back by regulation in the developed world. And I would frame that as a triangle. So first we've had Basel, and with each implementation of Basel, it's gotten worse. And Basel Endgame really makes project finance for institutions like Citibank or Bank of America incredibly complex and really difficult to go into emerging markets. And then you layer on top of that national regulation. So for example, in the United States, we've interpreted Basel to say, even if you use risk defeasance tools from the development institutions, for which the US taxpayers are the largest shareholders in those institutions, you do not get any risk-weighted asset relief. So it's super complex to be able to make those trades actually hurdle. And then on top of it, you have internal compliance. And as the regulators have gotten more and more into the weeds of how do these banks operate, trying to create financial stability after the crisis, internal compliance has made it even harder. And there's a lot of myths in these institutions, and it's hard to trace. Okay, is it Basel? Is it national regulation? Or, is it compliance? And then even worse, across the G7, they've all interpreted Basel differently. And so it's easier to do long-term, long-dated project finance in Japan, kind of medium in Europe, and super hard in the United States. So there's this whole piece of work that we need to just step back and ask ourselves, is there some unintended consequence from the regulation we've put in place? And if you actually look at institutional investors and pension funds and insurance companies, Solvency II and issues around that do very similar things. So there's a whole piece of work that needs to be done there. And then the third bucket, which I'm actually very optimistic about, but I do think, in having sat on both sides of the fence now, development institutions don't really understand commercial banks and capital markets, and commercial banks don't understand development institutions. And I spend a lot of my time translating between the two, and I feel like we need to get people together in small rooms and really start collaborating and understanding, okay, that's your constraint, this is my constraint. We're all really bright finance people. There's solutions to those things, but we need to understand what the real constraints are and then start solving for them.
Yeah, sure, and I think that this kind of interstitial space between the developed finance and private finance is something that we'll return to in this conversation, certainly. Alix, you mentioned a couple of desired outcomes in your opening remarks. You mentioned a net zero world by roughly mid-century, and you mentioned growth targets that are essential to be met. Now, you've really pushed for keeping outcomes front of mind and then working backwards and developing strategies to achieve them. How do you think we should approach those processes of starting with outcome and then really working to underlay it?
Yeah. Maybe I'll make two sort of related points there. And actually, it's building a little bit on this discussion about risk and risk tolerance. I think when we're thinking about financing innovation for development and for climate resilient development, one of the things I think that it's really important for donors to do is to find ways to reform their internal processes so that they are more comfortable with looking at the performance of a portfolio of grants or investments as opposed to looking project by project about whether something failed or succeeded. And that requires a lot of cultural change within donor agencies in particular, where rightly, technocrats have become increasingly risk averse and increasingly gun shy about the potential for being brought before Congress or some other body to explain why a particular project failed. We all sort of remember the case of Solyndra in the US when the Department of Energy backed this company that happened to fail, and it was on the headlines of why is the government in the business of picking winners, et cetera, et cetera. That's also the same year that the US was backing some of Tesla's early investments in electric vehicles and battery technology that really paid off quite well for the US taxpayer. If you look at those two things on a portfolio basis, that was a great year for innovation in that sector. But we were uncomfortable in the bureaucracy of thinking that way. And this is something that we particularly came across at the Global Innovation Fund. One of the reasons that GIF was set up outside of the government of the UK, outside of the government of the US, was so that it could have a different attitude towards risk than would be possible within DFID or within USAID. I think we need to explore more vehicles for accelerating innovation like that. So that's my sort of first point. Think about measuring impact on a portfolio basis as opposed to a project basis. I think one other point I'd urge for this group of us thinking about energy is to resist goals that count connections as opposed to counting real access and abundance of energy that people need. It's easier to count connections. I understand why we do that, but that's too far up the impact pathway for the things that we really care about, even if it makes sort of meeting an SDG goal around energy seem more daunting.
I want to stick on this issue you bring up of portfolio level impact. What do you, given what you've just said, make of some of the new approaches, strategies, instruments that seek to take a portfolio or country level approach to finance? So I'm thinking of things like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, thinking of things like an Energy Transitions Accelerator for a country, or even a more sort of broad package of investments that are all seeking to have a broader objective, but have, at this point, a fairly mixed track record.
There, I think I would go back to some of this, the point I made earlier about thinking about different kinds of bargains, so that plans or larger platforms really are locally led and demand driven, and then there's local proposal for this is what we plan to do and want to do around state capacity, around regulatory reform, around our own planning, and then what can happen on a financial side of that from donor countries or other partners. I think we haven't really figured out how to have good quality conversations about those topics that aren't sort of either where one side or the other feels as though they're being imposed upon. So I think we have to continue to think about what does it really mean to be locally led and with local priorities coming first. I think a good thing for us to collectively look anew at is the US Millennium Challenge Corporation that really does work with governments to figure out compacts, multi-year compacts that reflect local priorities, and then a multi-year, dependable commitment from the MCC to finance those projects that are specifically intended by the mandate of the MCC to contribute both to growth and to resilience. So I think that's been existing a bit outside of these conversations about just energy transitions, even within the USG, frankly. And so I think actually we could join that up a little bit more and learn some new lessons.
Yeah, thanks.
Jackson, can I
please
just jump in here for 1 second?
Absolutely.
Because I work quite heavily on the JETPs in particular. And I would actually frame it in 3 things. So first, the why. Now, the JETP countries that were chosen for really good reasons, right? These are the countries where we're going to have the fastest growth of energy because there's going to be economic growth or planned economic growth in relatively large populations. So we know if we can make that greener, it's going to be better for the environment. So the why was clear. I think the what wasn't clear when we started, but as people started thinking, okay, what gets financed? What they realized was you need a whole of economy approach that takes the public sector and the private sector and looks at it holistically together. And how do you actually get the levels of economic growth you're projecting? How much energy you need to do that? And then how do you transmit and distribute, not just generate the power? And if you look at like the JETP in South Africa, it was very clear that they're doing a great job on renewables, but their transmission and distribution grid needs lots of work. The place that we're still really stuck now is the how. So governments, donors have made commitments, private sector has made commitments, but they were up here and they were kind of vague. So how do you actually blend that money together to actually make those plans that come out of the what doable? And I don't think we've figured that out yet. I mean, we still struggle with blended finesse more large, on a larger level, but in these JETPs, that's the piece we still have to figure out because the money's not flowing yet.
Right. Well,
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
Can I
please,
jump in?
absolutely.
I think JETP is a great example of there must be always a balance between ownership and will, international community will. And here there was a very strong will and a little bit of less ownership, right? So if you have less ownership, it's more difficult to have this holistic conversation about the economic effects or how to distribute this money and where to target. With SEforALL, we've been just doing an energy transition investment plan for Barbados with very, very small reality. And there, it's the opposite, right? They have the will. They have a 2030 net zero strategy. Now, with our help, they learned that probably it's not possible to have a 2030 target. They have to move it to 2035. But still, the cost of the investment would raise the tariffs that the local population has to pay to a level that is politically not viable. So now you need blended finance to lower it. And it could be a small investment, right? It's less than 300,000 people. When I want to pull their legs, I say it's 2 condominiums of Beijing. But that kind of conversation is harder to open because development banks and development agencies are not so ready to engage out of their planning. So there is a little bit of discrepancy between ownership process and will.
Mm-hmm. We're going to stick on you, Stefano, and hear some more Barbados-like stories of how transitions can work effectively. But I just want to tag on a little bit to this JETP conversation and say that one of the manifestations of these challenges that you all are bringing up is a lack of a coherent syndicated finance source. from the top down. And when we hear from Indonesian, Vietnamese, Senegalese, South African stakeholders who are the destination countries for these JETPs, that is towards the top of the list for each of them, and what is difficult in the execution of the JETP. And the difficulties range from how they can access finance at any volume overall to much more kind of granular challenges of having to deal with these different sources, which have different preferences, different regulatory policies for how finance can be operationalized, different fundamental characteristics of what the finance is itself in terms of grants, concessional loans, et cetera. So, getting back to your what part, right? A real agreement about what is the what, I think, is a starting point there. So, again, as mentioned, Stefano, you at SEforALL are really focused on productive uses for energy. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about where you found new effective approaches for productive use for energy that's really impacting people's lives in a meaningful way.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, when we talk about access, I totally agree with Stephanie that if we focus only on connectivity, and so we say we gave access to 25,000 people in Madagascar, which is something that SEforALL facilitated. It's a number, it's an easy to sell number, right? But then what access means, it's to be defined, I would say. If access means that they have a light bulb and they can charge a cellular phone, okay, this doesn't change their life completely. It's already a big change. I don't underestimate it. But at the same time, access should be the kickstart of economic growth, right? And it's the baseline of this. So what we've seen that is a little bit lacking, and it could be having incredible effect, especially in rural areas, which are the one where access is not there, is having renewables for productive uses. I give you a few examples. One for sure is, of course, solar pumping, irrigation. I mean, there is a way that this energy can increase the livelihood and the agricultural productivity in areas that have different problems of land degradation, water degradation. So one part is the irrigation, one part is food processing through wind or solar, which is another way to increase the productivity and to free time, especially from women, to have other activities on the side. One part is cooling and storage. I mean, we know from FAO how much food is wasted, especially in these developing countries. Probably at least 1/3 of the production goes wasted because there is no value chain of cold that is supporting the agricultural system. And also this is, in an off-grid context, an incredible use for renewables. And finally, again, considering that there is a widening belt of the world where desertification is growing, all the part of water purification and water desalination that could be done in small batches through solar energy could really make the change. So this to say, when we do our planning of this kind of interventions, we don't have to really only focus on a solar battery system for a household, but really create the premises for these households to thrive. And so this is something that we take into account when we do our planning, but it's also something that we would like to see a little bit more in the planning of donors, right? We are more on the action side, and we propose projects to different donors, from philanthropists to governments, but we also are aware that there are points of view and fashions and all this, so we would like this to see more and more. So yeah, this would be my take on it.
These are inspiring stories, and I think we can all agree that we'd like to see more of those sorts of initiatives, projects, and outcomes that you just described. I do want to pivot us back, though, to Alix's opening remarks about the immorality of rolling back economic growth where it's needed in countries like India, and apply onto that some pretty specific decisions that have to be made about sources of energy and energy infrastructure. And here I want to get into the intersection of the kinds of variable renewable energy sources like wind and solar with firm power. And I mean that both from fossil and non-fossil sources. So this includes the potential expansion of natural gas in developing markets. This includes the potential expansion of nuclear, both of which have different environmental externalities that are confronting and that are certainly not a no regrets approach, but in some cases might be the best approach for those particular communities, at least in the short term. One could argue, but that is a debated point. And I'd love to hear all of our panelists weigh in on that intersection. Let's start with you, Stephanie.
So, a very difficult but a great question. And I actually really do think the just piece of the energy transition matters. And when I look at Africa in particular, which is 4% of global GHG emissions, and the developed world says to African nations, you can only have energy if you do wind and solar, and you can't have adequate baseload to build industries of the future. That doesn't feel right to me. And you mentioned Senegal, so there's a lot of diesel in Senegal. So we'll keep burning diesel, and we won't allow you to have gas, but you can do some renewables in the middle. To me, there's a lot of donor funding that's gone into the build of wind and solar in Africa, and it's actually become a race to the bottom in terms of how those transactions are financed. I would love to see some of that donor money be redirected so that when a sponsor comes and says, we're going to do a twin cycle combined engine gas power, it's actually designed and built so that when we have hydrogen, it can be converted to hydrogen, and the cost differential from a capital perspective is covered by that donor funding. And then when I look to nuclear, I actually think that 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl set us back many, many years in the wrong direction. I think SMRs are a super interesting solution for distributed generation, in particular distributed generation in places like Africa, because I think it helps solve I can plug in my refrigerator and charge my cell phone and have a light bulb, but that's all I get, and I only get it when the sun shines. So I think we need to do more on that, and I think, Alix, you'll probably say this, but we need to encourage the development institutions to start thinking about how you finance nuclear. I know it's a conversation that we have certainly started inside Citi, and what role should commercial institutions play. The last thing I would note, though, is that there are a handful of countries in the world today that still have maintained the educational base that's necessary for a nuclear energy proliferation. And many of them, in the 1980s, actually dropped that out of their curriculum. So we've got a shortage of really good scientists and a need to start educating early on in that education. How do we actually bring nuclear into the power mix?
Yeah, that's a great point on capacity and workforce development. I think we can apply obviously unique but similar points to some other energy sectors as well. Alix.
I really agree with what Stephanie has said. I think we can understand why at the time that the Charter of the World Bank or IFC was written, that they said that they would not be involved with nuclear energy. But the times are changing now. And I think a really good signal that we actually saw very recently was the US Development Finance Corporation clarified that they, in fact, will be investing in nuclear projects. And I think if you see a track record of this, that it can be done, especially if there's some opportunities to partner with folks like Citibank or other private banks, maybe there will be some additional momentum that we can all put our shoulders behind. I do think that countries in Africa that have natural gas assets that they have not fully exploited, to expect them not to do so and not to borrow privately to do so simply isn't realistic. And we need to, if we're thinking about platforms and how the public sector and private sector and different forms of capital come together, I think we should be realistic about the use of those assets. In the US, we're taking a, all of the above approach, and we're still being very ambitious about our climate targets. I think we can do exactly the same thing in the developing country context.
Yeah, interesting point. Yeah.
So, this is a very contentious topic, of course. What I would say is we I think it depends a lot on the capacity, and of course nuclear is an option, but if we want to frame it in the climate time that we've given to ourselves, so to halve the emissions by 2030 and to go net zero by 2050, we have to make sure that this is the most timely technology, right? So far, the small reactor are not a reality. They are in place. Maybe we will have development in 5, 7, 8 years, which is already over 2030. While the traditional ones, it's 15 at least. And let's not forget that ever since the technology has been there, we have installed 370 gigawatt of nuclear energy. And last year, we have installed 473 gigawatt of renewable energy in 1 year. So all this to say that the speed of deployment of renewables, it's very competitive in comparison to the one of nuclear energy. What is lacking on the renewable side is the infrastructure to make it stable, right? Because we have infrastructure to make oil and gas a system, no, that is working 24 hours for us, but we have not yet created a system for renewables to be able to work for us 24 hours a day. So I think these are policy choices, and then I agree that if there are the premises for a differentiated energy mix, is probably even safer. But all this, I would like to stress the time factor when we have this conversation.
So what do you see as the most promising pathways for 24-hour-a-day renewable energy sources? So should we be thinking about expanding pumped hydro? Is it about batteries?
I think it's a mix. We are creating a new system somehow, right? So there will be a lot of trials and failures as well. Of course, hydrogen is a promising technology for storage. Hydro pumping is for sure one, even if there is a debate on the environmental sustainability. And then, yeah, battery storage should increase. And I've seen how this is already driving the market in upgrading the technology, right? Now we are debating on critical minerals, but we still don't know what will be tomorrow, right? And probably in 10 years we have been, putting our heads on how to secure lithium for everybody, and that lithium we don't need anymore. So I think also this kind of research and development dynamic has to be factored in. But since we don't know, I mean, things are happening, but we are not aware. It's difficult to make a real guess.
Yeah, I'm glad that several people have brought up hydrogen. And I just want to pile on there a little bit as well. I think hydrogen's versatility and overall utility is quite alluring. And I think that's the reason that we're acknowledging it. For transportation, for production, for storage, for an off-ramp for natural gas as well, potentially, and a real kind of bridge to a future use of a cleaner combustible source. But when we look at the economics of hydrogen as they exist today, I think there's some pretty steep hills to climb, right?
There is no demand, right?
We need much stronger demand signals, exactly. And we need specific offtake agreements that can spur that supply. And at the same time, those demand signals are hesitating because there isn't the infrastructure development pipeline and larger ecosystem to produce the hydrogen and get it to where it needs to be used in many instances to give the sources of demand that confidence.
Yeah, but this is chicken and egg,
right?
Chicken and egg. Yeah, they are real. They're waiting.
Yeah,
right?
and
So
I think, go ahead, please. Yeah.
One place we can learn some lessons about that from is in the public health and vaccine space. Operation Warp Speed for the COVID vaccine was essentially a series of advanced market commitments so that manufacturers were clear on what they stand to benefit when they manufacture this vaccine. Volume guarantees that Gavi and others offer for other kinds of vaccines also, create demand signals that then allow pharmaceutical companies to plan for capacity, not just to do the first stage of R&D, which isn't always a holdup, but to plan for adequate capacity to produce products, especially if they're worried about individual willingness to pay in developing country context. So I think exploring advanced market commitments in the climate space, as has been advocated by researchers at the University of Chicago, like Rachel Glenister, for example, is something I think it would be worth a lot of us spending some more time thinking about.
But Jackson,
yeah, go ahead, please.
On the same, so I spent a lot of time investing in telecom and tech. And if you look at, okay, so we had CDMA and we had GSM, two competing technologies. And when they were competing, we didn't have mobile networks in emerging markets because it was too expensive. What actually ultimately kicked that cost curve down was GSM becoming the global standard and moving, from the upper middle income to the middle income to the lower income. I think what's foggy in all of this is battery storage. There's 7 types of batteries out there. Which one's going to win? And people are sort of waiting to say, okay, how do I back the winning horse? I think the same thing is true for fuels. And there's an extended period of time in which hydrogen, biofuels, all these different kinds of fuels are going to compete until we land on the 1 or 2 that are going to be the fuel.
Winners.
I think we're going to see these issues continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that standardization is vital, as are these kind of forward demand signals. They need to be coupled in many cases. I think the hydrogen infrastructure landscape is a good example, with some public money, because it's not going to be profitable to develop certain parts of this overall pipeline. And so, really judicious and smart public investment, which there's plenty of precedent for in all sorts of different industries.
That's why NEOM is past shovel ready, right? Because the Saudi administration and government has really stepped in to fund that big project.
Yeah, please.
No, and I think we are seeing the budding of this, right? The Department of Energy is putting money on hydrogen. The European Union is creating hydrogen valleys, so districts where they want to create the demand, at least at district level, so that they see how it works. So I think there is a budding policy that is shaping up, and then I think it's also exciting to see the competition, right? Because it's different way of producing the molecules, and again, also there we will see where the technology will settle. So meanwhile, it's not easy for investors, and it's not easy for the technology of the end use to figure out where to go. So that's what is slowing down a little bit the process.
We're fast approaching the end of our time, and I think that several ideas have been teed up that we haven't given full attention to, and certainly won't be able to in the final 3 minutes, on this intersection of different types of finance, because ultimately it's this kind of capital that's going to be driving the energy transition outcomes that we seek. So Stephanie, I want to start with you, and then we'll just work this way, and ask you to elaborate a little bit more about how you see some of the solutions at the intersection of development and private finance that you see as most promising.
Yeah, so I think I said this earlier, and I've said this many times, we need radical collaboration. And where you see us being successful is where we've actually had those forms of collaboration. So I think there's 4 or 5 really interesting now big platforms that are out there. I would actually start with the very early work that IFC did around their MCPP platform, where they allowed institutional investors into pools of their projects. So again, to your point, Alex, how do we pool? And then we need to see how some of these better platforms, HSBC and Temelsec have a new platform, Pentagreen, where they call them marginally bankable projects. I mean, for an institution like IFC, they're bankable, but they're marginal for institutional investors, and we need to see how those kinds of structures actually play out, and can they standardize and bring to scale some of this.
Sure, that's a great example. Alix?
Yeah, I think I will just say a little, again, what I started off earlier a bit about thinking about different kinds of bargains around trade and technology transfer and regulatory reform and state capacity building, rather than thinking only about financial innovation, so that there's a sort of a more abundant spirit to some of our conversations around this.
Thank you. Stefano?
Yeah, on my side, I see a promising debate on the public side, right? There is this Bridgetown initiative launched by the Prime Minister of Barbados. There is a whole debate on World Bank, not only on portfolios, but also on how to reach these targets and what blended finance means and how much concessional and grant should have space in the budget of this public institution, because this is the leverage money, right? It is the money that should be put there to create an impact. So I think we are in a interesting moment of reflection on the sector, and I hope there will be good outcomes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just with one final word, I want to say something that's likely obvious, but I think warrants mentioning nonetheless, which is that the history of our energy sector is primarily one of addition, not of transition, when we think of different fuel sources. And combined with that, there's very little precedent for major industrialization without high emissions accompanying it. And we are challenged to do both of those things now to meet our development and climate goals in tandem. And I think we've heard some really great ideas here today about how to do so. So please join me in thanking the panelists.